Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just not sure I'm ready to buy this yet. I'm just not sure you're the right solution. This is really, really expensive. Or does this really meet my needs? All of these are examples of objections that we often hear in the middle toward the end of our sales cycle. And today our topic is going to be how to address these objections and how to know, is no really no, or does no mean not yet? And it might mean not yet for a number of different reasons. Today we're going to talk about a couple tools, strategies, and tips to help us all overcome those objections that come up at the end of the sales process. Those objections that come up when we think we're getting close to winning the opportunity, to signing the contract, to closing the deal, and all of a sudden something is said or questioned that gets in our way. My name is Julie Thomas, and I am the President and CEO of Value Selling Associates, and today I'm going to be your guide as we talk through these topics. And based on the registration for this topic, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is a pretty hot topic right now as we get close to closing 2017. We have only so many days, selling days left between now and the end of December. And depending on where we're located, holidays are going to impact that. Vacation schedules are going to impact that, so we may even have less days than we think we do. And yet we're all in the situation of having to meet our objectives or overachieve our objectives as we come to the close of the year. I am going to address questions at the end of this, and I also have a little gift for you today at the end of this. So if you stay on to the bitter end, I'll share some information with you. I also want to let you know that many of you asked a number of questions during the registration for this, which is great. And I am going to do my best to integrate and answer many of those questions that were posed throughout the next 45 to 50 minutes. If I don't address your question, we will be answering questions at the end, so please feel free to type them in. And also join us and share either your questions, comments on our social media platforms. Please join us, find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter if you have questions or comments as we go through today. We'd love to hear from you in any way that you care to join us today. So, handling objections. Well, as we think about this, what is an objection? Well, an objection is some level of resistance, whether it's a statement or a question, that becomes a barrier to moving forward with a purchase. So an objection can sound like a question, I don't really understand how this is going to address my needs, or I don't understand how this is packaged up. It could be a question, or it could just be a statement. I don't have the budget right now. I don't think this is worth it. As it turns out, I need to get other people involved in this. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves with a barrier, a hurdle that we need to get over before we are in a position to advance and close that sale. So we're going to be talking today about objections, what they are, and how to handle them. So let's right out of the gates, I'm going to open up a poll here, and I'd love to know from you, what are some of the objections that you hear most often? And I've opened up this poll, and I'd like you to share with us. Is it price? Is it because you're selling something that someone deems is just not a priority? It's really cool, Julie. I really think your product is neat, but it's just not a priority for me today. Or is it something like, you know what, we're good right now. We're all set. We've got that covered. Status quo is meeting our needs. We don't have a reason to change. Or maybe I think of something being a lot better or different. If it's something other than one of these four buckets that I pulled up, please go ahead and give us the details. Type it out in your question or your chat topic and share with us what you're seeing as some of those objections. And let's give it a few more seconds as I see you're all selecting one. Maybe it's hard because I'm kind of forcing you to select one and not a few, because often we hear all of these in different situations. But let's see what we got here in terms of results. Thank you for playing this game. Interesting, 46%, almost half of us, are running into the price objection. 28% of us are saying that it's not a priority. Interesting. We're going to talk significantly about both of those. 16% is status quo, which could be the same as a different solution. So very interesting that almost 3/4 of the objections that you all, at least in this sampling of a couple hundred people on today's line, of the objections that get in your way have to do with price or priorities. Very interesting. We're going to talk significantly about both of those as we go through this today. Objections are something that oftentimes salespeople fear. Yet my guess is, based on the fact that 75% of you say that the objections you're facing are one of two things most often, we should anticipate them, and we should be ready to address them because they are likely to come up in some way, shape, or form. So here's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. We're going to talk specifically about how people buy, because if we understand how people buy, we can better understand where those hiccups, barriers, or hurdles may show up in their buying process. We're also going to talk about how do we create urgency. How do we get people to make decisions in an urgent fashion? And as I looked through some of the pre-webinar questions, there were a number of questions that had to do with urgency. We're going to talk about the objection handling process in the context of the value selling framework and how we work with our clients to address these objections so they are not barriers to getting the sale, but just a step in the process on the journey of closing the sale. I'm going to give you some keys or hacks to some success and some different things that you can be doing immediately to better address and handle objections. And then last, we'll wrap up, address any questions that may come up during today's session, talk about the little surprise I have for you at the end of today's session, as well as let you know when our next webinar will be in December. So let's get into it. Well, earlier this week, I was reading an article in Psychology Today, and it was called The Psychology of Buying. And the article did not differentiate between consumer buying and business buying. It really addressed the psychology of how people buy when they're buying anything. And in this article, he talked about really 6 different stages that an individual goes through when making a purchase. The first one, probably not surprising, is they become aware. They become aware of something that they might need or that they might want. And that awareness might come out of their circumstances, but often as sales professionals, we are creating that awareness in our engagement with our prospects. As they become aware of something, then they start to identify what their needs are. What do I need as a result of this? I'm aware that my systems I'm outgrowing my systems, and they no longer support the needs of the business. So now I'm aware of that. I start to define, well, what do I need to do to fix it? What does that look like? What tools do I need? What technologies do I need from that perspective? And then they go and start to educate themselves. Oftentimes, the salesperson is integrally involved in that education. But in today's information world, oftentimes we are not. So interestingly enough, often these first 3 parts of this psychology of buying happen whether the sales rep has been engaged or not, which presents some challenges in and of itself. Once they go through that education, there's a filter that is in all of our minds that has to do with believability. Do I believe that that's the truth? Do I believe that that is really what it says it can do? Do I believe that there's credibility? Do I believe that it'll work? There is a believability filter that goes through when anybody's buying anything. At some point, most of us want to go and do some level of experience to eliminate our risk. If we're consumers shopping for shoes, we try them on. We want to experience that product and see how it looks, look in the mirror, walk around from that perspective. If we're buying something from a corporate perspective, we want to experience it in some way, typically, to make sure we completely understand it. Maybe it's a demo, maybe it's a reference, maybe it's a site visit, maybe it's some other way. But often, as salespeople, one of the steps in our process is to figure out how do we get our prospects to experience our product, our whatever it is, so that they fully understand it. And then last but not least is part of that psychology of buying. This doctor talked about at some point before we buy, we all become psychological owners of that solution, which means we can all fast forward when we're buying anything to how it looks and feels and will work for us. If we're buying a new car, we are psychologically fast forwarding to how we're going to be moving around in that car as once we take it home and put it in our garage. If we're buying a technology, we're going to fast forward to understand how those needs are met and how our problems are solved with that technology. But that psychological ownership of the solution is a critical component of the psychology of buying. And so the reason I found this article so powerful is I found that it mapped almost 100% to the key value buying process, which is a component of the value selling framework. So for those of you that are value selling clients and students, you've seen this before. But we often call this the CFO Talk Track. And when we are going to sell our products and services internally to someone to justify the sale, this is often the talk track that somebody has to have. And the reason it's important to understand this talk track is because this is the buying process that world-class sales reps facilitate in their engagement strategies. So first of all, if I'm sitting in front of my CFO and I say, hey, I want to spend $100,000 on X, whatever X is, the CFO is likely going to say, well, why? What's going on in this business that needs you to think that you need to spend $100,000 on that? Why are we doing this? And the next set of questions he's probably going to ask is, what are the challenges, or what are the opportunities, or what are the problems that is going to solve for us? And then he's probably going to ask, so what have you looked at? I know you're telling me that you want to spend $100,000 on this solution, but what alternatives did you look at? Did you vet them? Is this the best fit for us? Is this the best option for us? And in the context of value selling, we call that creating a vision match that's differentiated with the prospect. And it really helps the prospect understand by walking through those three sets of questions, should I even buy this? Should I? Does it even make sense? Does it impact the business? Does it solve problems that are worth solving? And is that a solution that's vetted and is absolutely the best alternative for us? If I'm the CFO and I'm convinced in that, the next thing I'm going to ask is it worth it? What's the return on this? Tell me about the business case. What can we expect as a result, or impact, or risk mitigation as a result of putting this solution in place? And we all know as sales professionals, we better have good answers to that. We better know what the real value is of our products and services, both to the business and to the individuals that we're serving. Assuming I get past that hurdle, the next question is, all right, who all has looked at this? Has this product been vetted? Has legal looked at the contract? Has all the users in agreement that this is the right solution? Have you vetted all of the people impacted by this purchase decision. And we call that understanding power. There's a lot of people today involved in most of the sales that you are working on. It is no longer a single decision maker. We need to understand everyone that gets involved in a consensus building decision-making process in that organization to ensure that no one is saying no and everyone is saying yes. And then the final step is this, which plays into this whole experiential psychology of ownership, is what have you done to make sure that this works the way it should and we will get the results that we have? What are the steps that you've gone through to fully evaluate this? Have you vetted it with references? Have you looked at demos? Have you understood that? Do you know for sure that this is going to work the way you said it could work? And we're going to get the results that we're going to get, that you expect to get with that. And this value buying process happens every time in every company a major purchase is being made. And what does that mean? Some of our processes we know are very deliberate. I'm sure many of you on the line can tell me about very rigorous, deliberate purchasing processes that some of your clients and prospects have had. Others might not be so deliberate, but at some point that information is being considered, understood, and acted upon in this buying process. So as a sales professional, our ability to be successful at facilitating this buying process is to understand how the people involved in this decision are answering these questions. And it's this fundamental buying process that is the foundation for our objection handling process. Because as we get into how we're going to address those objections, every objection that comes up is a result of one of the areas of this buying process not being as crystal clear and confirmed between you and the buyer as maybe you would hope. And I'll come back and explain a little bit about more exactly what that means. So what's going on? What's going on in our current reality? And I'm often talking to people, and as most of you know, I am still in sales today. I sell all the time, and I work with salespeople all the time. And it's apparent to me that most people don't want to be sold, but people do want to buy. And the whole concept of being sold means that I am pushing something on you that meets my needs, but not necessarily yours. And so people don't want to be sold, which is why the information age has freed people up from kind of the shackles of only having to listen to salespeople to get educated, to opening up all different ways that they can learn things. And because they're educated, they also come into sales cycles with us with predetermined ideas. And often we need to understand them. Maybe we even need to change them or break them to expand their horizons. Another thing here at value selling that we talk about all the time, and I'll describe why, is the close is not necessarily an event. It is the natural outcome of a well-executed sales process. In other words, it is not something that you have a specific skill to do. It is something that happens naturally when all the skills that you execute during the selling process are flawless and go well. Whenever somebody comes to me and says, hey, Julie, can you work with us? We need help with our closing skills. And as we start to dive into it and really identify what the root cause of that problem is, it is almost never that my salespeople don't know how to get a purchase order signed by the prospect. It's almost always that something is missed, overlooked, or just completely missed at the beginning of the sales cycle. The other thing is that in every class that we're working with, and I happened to be with some clients last week in Texas and started talking about objections, and they all raised their hands. And in this particular company, the sales rep said, we have three specific objections that come up every single time. One of them was price, one of them was why change, and then the other one had to do with more specifically some features and functions of their product itself. And so my question to them was, if you get these objections every single sales cycle, what's your plan? How do you anticipate them? And the interesting thing was there were a couple people that kind of looked at me like I was speaking a different language. What do you mean a plan? We're just hoping that they don't come up. Our plan is to hope and pray that the objection is never raised. Usually doesn't work because usually it's going to come up. So do we have a plan? Are we anticipating objections and preparing for them the same way that we're preparing to discuss our capabilities and our products? Only you can answer that question, but expect to know and have a plan. The other thing that's going on in today's world is, there's uncertainty in the economy depending on where you are and the industry you're in. And when there is uncertainty in the economy, risk aversion tends to get high. And when risk aversion tends to get high, value is much more important than ever before. And therefore, when the economy is in flux and uncertain, price sensitivity goes up. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Even for those of you that are on the line, and there's many of you on the line that sell some sort of a continuous service, whether it's a SaaS-based software type product where you are renewing it in a certain period of time, or it's a business service, or you sell something that you want to sell again and again and again. The uncertainty in the economy today could lead to price sensitivity in the future that you may not have experienced in the past. And then last but not last, the close, as I said, is a natural outcome, so it should not be a surprise attack. We shouldn't be sitting there in wolf's clothing hoping to leap out behind a door and say, gotcha, now you can buy. It is the natural outcome of a well-executed sales cycle. So one of the ways that we get to this close, and this is going to lead into how we address objections, is how do we create urgency? If we want to get to the point where someone's going to do business with us, we want them to have the urgency that we have in converting them to a customer or a client, or the same urgency to become a customer and client. So what creates urgency? And again, it is often the dialogue, understanding, and engagement that we have early on in those conversations that allows us to uncover and connect to that which they will perceive as urgent. So urgency is different than being panicked, because urgency is about the prospect having a desire to act quickly, and ideally act quickly with us, where panic is our ability, is our manifestation of, oh my goodness, I'm running out of time. How do I create urgency with incentives or what have you? We're going to talk about urgency coming from within the prospect itself. And urgency really comes from value. And here at Value Selling Associates, we always address two components of value. Personal value. At the end of the day, people make decisions, not buildings, not businesses, not corporations, not universities, not hospitals, people. And people are motivated by something. And our ability to understand the motivation of the people that we're selling to and connect to that with our solution creates a dimension of urgency that is critical. And the reality is, our prospects are motivated whether we know about it or not. They're motivated. So the best salespeople are very good at understanding that motivation, what we call personal value, and connecting to that with the implementation of their products and services. But beyond personal value, there's business value. And one of the fallacies that I often hear in companies when we start to look at their sales process and identify gaps that might be addressed with the value selling framework is people say, hey, here's our strategy. We get out there and we uncover the problems. And then we pitch our solution, and then we go through all these different stages. Great. But the reality is not all problems are worth solving. I'm sure everyone on this line could walk through the halls of their business. Shoot, you could probably walk the halls of my business and identify opportunities for improved efficiency. Yet some of those problems as a business executive, I'm willing to live with. They are not top of mind. They are not my priority. And the same is true of our clients. So not only do we need to understand the business value, we need to seek to find the problems that are worth solving. Because if we find the problems that are worth solving, those typically will have the urgency to be resolved. And then interestingly enough, again, we've got a lot of people on the line that are dealing with renewals, and I understand as we get through the end of December, many of us have renewals that are due right now. I've always worked in a renewal business myself, and coming into the fourth quarter, even when it was not my fourth quarter, it was often my client's fourth quarter where they were budgeting or executing on their plans for next year. So we also need to understand in those renewal situations, if we satisfied a need in the past, that need will no longer be a motivating factor to take action, and we have to go back and recreate the same level of urgency that we did with the first time we sold to them with the next time. Things have probably changed. People have almost always changed, and the perspective of what's important in that company has changed. So just because something created urgency in 2016 that brought them on board, we can't make the assumption that the same conditions, situations, and factors that led to the initial purchase will lead them to the second renewal, and we need to go back with the same rigor as a new business opportunity and understand that. So why do we get objections as we get into this? Well, objections are often resistance to change. Change is hard. We all know of people that, I know of someone that when they start to think about change in any situation, they break out in hives. Change can be hard and stressful for people, so unless there's a compelling reason, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go into the vast unknown. I want to stay where I'm at. Objection can also be a real question or concern. I'm just not sure that this set of capabilities is going to get us where we need to go. Or I may have a real concern about packaging or functionality or something like that. I could also raise an objection because I have a hidden agenda. I could have a preference to something else, and I'm trying to raise objections to convince my colleagues that this is really not the thing that we want to do. So sometimes the objections can be a result of a pre-existing preference or what some people might call a hidden agenda to do something else. And then last but not least, we often get objections because they're a negotiating tactic. As we get to the end of our sales cycle, nobody wants to acknowledge the phenomenal value we're going to bring to their business, because they want to then get the best deal they can. And if they talk about value, it takes the focus off of price. So oftentimes these objections are negotiating tactics. And what's important about understanding a negotiating tactic is truly acknowledging, is that where we are? Because I'm going to probably handle that a little bit differently if it's just a true question or concern or need for more information. So we've talked about this before, but I would suggest that all of you should be looking at what are the objections that we have. Look at the opportunities you've won in the last 9 to 12 months. What objections came up through that process? How did you address them and what worked? And try to be prepared for those because they're going to come up. The other thing is objections, while they might be scary, are positive. Because if there is a question or a concern in a prospect's mind and they don't raise it, we will likely lose every time. So the objections that come up are important because it means we're engaged, we're in dialogue, and we're expanding our understanding of the context that our prospect is working on. And that doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that we go raise all the objections or that we create concern or anything like that. But what it does say is our attitude on how we handle these objections is critical to how successful we are in addressing them. So here again at Value Selling Associates and the programs that we work with our clients on, we teach a process that can be used for handling any of these objections. And what I want you to think about is it's the process itself, not the words you say, that are as important as ever. Oftentimes when I'm in a classroom with a client and we'll practice this in the classroom and we'll role model them, everybody's trying to write down the perfect words to address an objection. And it's not as much about the words as the process that you go to come up with the words of how you're going to address it. So as we said, it is all about attitude. We don't want to look like the deer in the headlights. We don't want to break out in a cold sweat and be fearful of these. We want to embrace them because addressing them means that we're one step closer to winning the business. The next thing that is really, really important in any objection that is raised is really clarify to understand what the question is. Really making sure we understand the question and why it's being asked is just as important to understanding what the question is. Years ago, I was working with a client, and they were in the consulting business. And one of the sales reps told a story that I loved as relevant to this specific situation. He told me about a time, and he was selling some services to Yale New Haven Hospital on the East Coast in New Haven, Connecticut. Big, prestigious hospital that anybody in the healthcare world would want to have their logo on their client side. And they were working on what was a big, really big opportunity for them from a consulting project, and it was going to be a multi-million-dollar project. And as often happens with a big deal like that, the sales rep pulled together a tiger team of people in his company that had expertise and empowerment to put together what they thought was the absolute best proposal to put their leg forward and present their capabilities. So the day of what I will call the beauty contest presentations, where 4 different vendors were coming in to present their capabilities and all that, my client actually had the opportunity to say he was going to be last, which is often a nice place to be if you're doing those types of presentations. So he was last, and they were so proud of what they were doing and so proud of the investment summary they had put together because they really felt like they were right on the mark and it was an ideal fit. And hands went up in the presentation and they started getting a number of questions and statements probing and concern about the pricing. And the sales rep said, he said, I was getting very afraid because I had nowhere else to go. We had put together such a good project and a good project plan and a good investment summary. We really didn't have a whole lot of negotiating room. Well, he stopped and started asking a lot of questions to understand why these questions were coming up. And what turned out was the concern wasn't that the price was too high. The concern was that they were lowballing the price, and therefore they may get nickeled and dimed in the future or run into a situation where quality diminished because they had underbid the project. And so once he understood that, it was less defending the price and more defending the plan and the fact that they could deliver in the price that was proposed. So clarification is critical, because we don't want to address the wrong question and we need to understand the why behind the what. Once we've done that, we go back into this diagnose stage. What area of that value buying process is this objection applying to. If it's price, it is always value. If it is timing or need or this isn't a priority now, it is almost always the business issue. We're solving problems that aren't worth solving. So going through that diagnostic allows us to figure out, where in this sales cycle or this customer's buying journey has something gone out of alignment? Has something that I thought we were on the same page with changed and we are no longer on the same page? The next step is what we call a sharp angle close. And this is one of the key ways to identify if this is objection, is a negotiating tactic, or if it's a true question. And when we talk about a sharp angle close, we talk about our mechanism and a way for us to isolate that objection. And it might sound something like this. If we get past these pricing questions you have and you're in agreement that the investment we're asking you to make is worth it, is there anything else that would prohibit you from moving forward? And the reason we want to do that is if it is a negotiating tactic, we want to surface all of the objections that we possibly have so that we can then negotiate on a multitude of issues and not just price. We can open up, there might be concessions that we could make about terms or functionality or deliverables or other ways to add more value. And we can only do that if we expand the conversation to multiple metrics. And so sharp angle close, phenomenal tactic and skill to identify, is this objection just a negotiating tactic or could it be something else? And then at the end, we do have to address it. And we can address it in a number of different ways. If we've identified that a part of the buying process is no longer where we thought it was, we will go back into our questioning process. If we identify that they are now leaning toward a competitive alternative, we might go back into that vision match and understand how we can better differentiate our solution. But we really want to diagnose and understand which of those areas. I've been in sales for almost 30 years, hard to believe, a long, long time. And the reality is every objection that I have faced has fit into one of these buckets. Now, sometimes I need to do a lot of digging to figure out exactly what bucket it is, but all of them fit into one of these buckets. And why do things change over time? Well, most of us are selling things where a sales cycle happens over time. So things change, people change, the companies and the industries that we work with are dynamic. So just because something was crystal clear on day one, 2 weeks later, I could have a new executive in that role and the entire purview of priorities and issues and problems could change overnight. So that diagnostic is important, and then understanding how I can go back into that. Now, interestingly enough, if price comes up as an objection and we've never had the value conversation, I'm incredibly at a disadvantage as a sales rep. So part of the goal of this buying process is to execute on it and have good discovery conversations about these things before we ever present, propose, or describe the investment that's going to be required to do our business. Because once that number's out there, we're done. We want to focus on this first and make sure we have this understanding in good context so that when it comes to push comes to shove and we do negotiate it, and let's face it, everybody wants to feel like they're getting a good deal. So there will be some negotiation at some point, that we have good legs to stand on because we've done a good job early on in the sales cycle. So what are some of the ways that we can do this? Well, certainly as part of the psychology of buying, we need to establish credibility. If one of the criteria for a buyer as they go through their processes is what the psychologist in Psychology Today talked about, the believability filter. We need to be believable, and to be believable, we need to be credible, and to be credible, we need to be ethical and honest, and all of those things that go in. So goes without saying, we know that we need to do that to establish long-term success. We also need to be very good at focusing on differentiation and focusing on how we can differentiate from the competitive alternatives so we can uncover incremental value that accrues only to our solution. Many of our clients come to value selling specifically to build the skill set and competencies all around differentiation. And differentiation, as I'm sure many of you know, is not the same as just being different. It's the process by which I create need for the things I do better or different or unique. Seeking to understand value selling and our clients that we work with, the questions are more important than the answers. How you engage and learn your prospects' world and context is important. Many of the product functionality objections that I coach clients on are because they introduced functionality or features that the prospect didn't care about too early in the sales cycle and inadvertently gave the prospect a reason not to do business with them. Anytime we start going on and on about our product or our cool features, and everyone on this line sells something that's really cool and really important and really critical, if we start talking about that first, we will almost inevitably give somebody a reason not to buy because we tell them about something they don't care about. Anticipate and prepare. Anticipate and prepare for objections the same way you do everything else. We know they're the same. They may sound a little bit different. The question may be phrased a little bit different. But most of the objections that you are going to receive are going to fall into one of a couple of different buckets. And if we prepare, we can practice. We can figure out what works and replicate those best practices. So let's, as we wrap this up, and please, if you have questions, share them as we get through this. What have we talked about? Well, we've talked about that the close is a natural evolution of a well-executed sales process. And a sales process should be a way for us to facilitate a buying process. And for those things to be successful, we need to be prepared and we need to know about the prospect's perspective. It's all about what they know, not what we know. It's all about what they think, not what we think. When I'm talking to sales reps, I mean, I think it's great that you think that you're the best fit for the client that you're talking to or the prospect that you're working with. But what I really want to know is, does the prospect think the same thing? Urgency is all a function of value. And it's not your value, and it's not your value proposition. It's their understanding of the real quantifiable value that you can bring to their business. And if we're going to quantify value, we've got to be solving problems that are worth solving, that are connected to the business of that company, not just to a technology problem. And again, be prepared and practice those objections so that we're ready for them. We know they're coming, so let's be ready for them. So let me open up the question tab and go through some of the questions that that you may have as we go through this. Here's an interesting question. What do you find is the most difficult part about this approach? And here's the challenge that we all have as sales reps. And I'm going to go back to that value buying process slide that is in this deck. Bear with me. The challenge that we have is to be effective at facilitating this conversation before we ask for the order. It is getting a complete understanding of their issues, problems, their solution, creating the context for us to demonstrate our capabilities and educate them on why they should select us after we've got that vision match set up. Uncover and quantify the value with the right people doing the right things to be convinced before we go and start to ask for the business. That's the challenge. The easy thing is to give somebody a price when they ask for it, to give them a proposal, to comply with the request. Just tell me what you got, Julie. Just tell me what you do. And when we fall into that trap, we are at tremendous risk to be successful. How do we change the conversation from price to value? Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't the issue, in my opinion, isn't that we change the conversation from price to value. It's that we have the value conversation prior to having the price conversation. So once we've focused on price, it is very, very difficult to get off that metric of conversation. So the opportunity for us is to not address price at all until we've got a good understanding about the potential real value we can bring to that organization. And if we understand value and go to price and price gets questioned, we can go back to value. But if we never understand value and we go to price and price is an issue, we don't really have a leg to fall back on because we don't know if they think it's worth it if we haven't had that conversation to begin with. Here's a question. Does objection handling change at the different stages of the sales cycle? Absolutely. And the objection handling process that I'm talking about today is really having to do with objections that happen in the middle towards the end of the sales cycle. Oftentimes, objections that you have at the beginning of the sales cycles are just a big brush off to not engage. As a matter of fact, I'm going to talk to you in a few minutes about the offer I have for you in the next couple of weeks. And we have a whole different approach to objections that come up during prospecting. I don't have time to meet with you. I don't have budget, so why would I even meet with the sales rep? All of those things that really aren't even real objections, but they are the brush off to avoid engagement and avoid a conversation or avoid a meeting. So yes, objection handling changes based on where you are and how engaged you are. Let's see, I've got room for a couple of more. How do you persuade a customer who tells you he won't buy from you unless you blank? So I'm going to assume that this is a customer who gives you an ultimatum that says, I'm not going to buy from you unless you do X, whatever X is. You know, ultimatums are a challenge, right? So here's one of the tactics, and hopefully as sales professionals, you all kind of think this way and realize this. We are all empowered to do so much in a negotiation, after which at some point, either probably our manager or somebody in finance or somebody else would have to approve that. So number one, know your empowerment. But number two, know your non-negotiables, because there are times when ultimatums really should be walked away from. Just because you're prepared to walk away doesn't always mean the prospect's going to let you go through the door. But we need to stand our ground on those things that are non-negotiable. And I often talk to people and they're like, you know, they're telling us they can only do this if our client does X, and X is a non-negotiable. I work with another training company who's got a wealth of intellectual property, and they've got some of their clients that expect them to assign their IP to them. Well, it's not going to happen. So, you know, you got to know your walkaway, you've got to know your non-negotiables, and you've got to be prepared to say, you know what, I appreciate your ask. We're not a good fit if that's your expectation, and let them know that you are prepared to walk away from that. It's hard as a sales. I've never met a sales rep who really wants to walk away from a deal, which is why sometimes you need to count on your manager to make that decision and defer to that higher authority. And then last but not least, what do you do when the objection is coming from a third party? So for example, I'm talking to someone, and all of a sudden the objection that is coming up is quote unquote from my boss, or from the man behind the curtain, if you will, if you like the Wizard of Oz reference. Well, that is another breakdown in the buying process, where when we are getting third-hand objections, we know we're not dealing with the real power. Because in an ideal world, we're dealing with the objections and the questions and the concerns and the barriers from the person who has them in first person. Because we know, just like when you play telephone and a story gets told between 2 or 3 different people, by the time it gets back to the actual source that wants that information, it is likely not to be presented, described, or even the same content as it was in the initial conversation. So when I'm dealing with someone that's coming to me, so-and-so has this objection, or this came from the C-suite, the first tactic we want to have is figure out how can we negotiate for access to have a conversation with the person face-to-face. And is that truly a concern from that person, or is it a smokescreen where I can try to avoid conflict by saying, you know what, Julie, if it was up to me, I'd do business, but Joe keeps saying no because, and no, you can't talk to Joe. So it can also be a way for someone, a bush for someone to hide behind and not have to deal with any confrontation or conflict. So if I did not get a chance to answer your questions, please let me know. I will reach out to many of you as well based on the questions that are in here. But let me share with you that today's slides and resources, you can download the slides right from GoToWebinar. You'll see a handout there. And there's a second handout that's also there. And in that handout, we have our information on our Vortex Prospecting Workshop that is coming up in Denver. If you in any way, shape, or form are struggling to get enough opportunities into your pipeline, enough meetings that you can even execute on value selling or begin to have these conversations, then the Vortex Prospect Workshop is for you. And because you're on today's webinar and because we only have a few slots left, I'm offering you a coupon that you can get $500 off the attendance for this workshop. So in the flyer that you can download right here is information and more detailed objectives about that workshop. Please look at it, talk to your manager or whoever you need to talk to, and if you're struggling to fill your pipeline, then you really should be attending this workshop at the end of November. We selected Denver because it's in the middle, and hopefully everybody could get there very easily if they needed to. And when I say the middle of the United States, the middle of North America. But please consider participating in that workshop. We'd love to see you there, and we do only have a few slots left. Last but not least, please follow us. Join the conversation about objections and anything else that you are challenged with when it comes to your sales development and professional sales career. We're going to do something different with the December webinar, and I invite you to participate in this. It's going to be a pure coaching call. And so we are going to ask for you, if you want to join us, to submit questions. Maybe it's you're stuck in an opportunity. Maybe it's a challenge that you're facing. Maybe it's an objection that you're getting that is just getting in the way of your success. But we're going to take those questions early during the registration period, and we're going to pick a half dozen of them, and we're going to go through that coaching for those questions on the line. And my experience is often the same question that's facing one salesperson is the same exact question facing another salesperson even if they work for different companies and different industries and things like that. So look for that. Look for that registration link. It'll be coming out shortly, and it will be available at valueselling.com. And if you have a question that you'd like us to engage with and ask specifically, please register and send us a question. If you don't have a question, please just register, because there's a good chance you might learn something from a struggle that somebody else is having. And then last but not least, please do not hesitate to reach out directly. Find me on LinkedIn if you haven't already. And here is my direct contact information, both phone and email. Would love to hear from you. Would love to hear how you apply what we've talked about today to get closer to yes and further from no and get those opportunities closed. With that, I'm going to wish everybody a wonderful rest of the week, and we will look forward to talking to you again in December. Thank you for joining Value Selling and participating in today's webinar.